Week 2 is officially in the books. Is it too soon to hit the panic button in fantasy football? We're going to discuss that with 9 different players today. All 9 players went within the top 4 rounds of fantasy football drafts, with the exception of one, 4th, 5th round kind of guy. But still, these are important guys on your fantasy football teams that you need to make decisions upon. Should I have patience, or is it time for me to start panicking and potentially look for some pivots? So let's start with the guy that is on your screen over on YouTube, Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills. We're going to fly through these players in the order in which the games were played this weekend. Dalton Kincaid, second week in a row now that there has been some concern. You spent a 4th round pick on this guy. He was being drafted as a top 5 tight end in drafts this year. He's not giving you more than 7.3 fantasy points this year. And frankly, it seems like he's kind of blended in with the rest of these Buffalo pass catchers. So Cameron, I'll start with you. Should we have some patience here with Dalton Kincaid, or are you starting to get worried?
I think we should have some patience because if we're being honest, the tight end position as a whole has been extremely disappointing. This last week, let me see. I think Pat Freiermuth was the tight end 12 with 7.9 fantasy points. Brenton Strange for Jacksonville was the tight end 9 with only 9.5 fantasy points, right? So the tight ends as a whole have gotten off to a pretty slow start. And, I think you look at the game script last week too, for the Buffalo Bills. Josh Allen only threw the ball or only completed 13 passes for 130 yards. You're just not going to get, great fantasy points at the tight end position if your quarterback's just not throwing the ball a ton. So no, I'm not too worried about Dalton Kincaid.
I think the thing that worries me with Dalton Kincaid is that because we spent a 4th round pick on him and all the elite tight ends have been very underwhelming thus far, that's where I'm starting to get a little bit shaky here. Like if you're over on YouTube, you can see the panic meters about 55, 60% maybe. So I'm kind of at like a tipping point here of if I get 2 more weeks of this from Dalton Kincaid, I am definitely going to be much more towards the panic side. But if he has a bounce back week here in the next 2 weeks, I wouldn't be surprised at the same time. What about you, Ty? Are you exercising patience here, or are you leaning more towards panic?
I would phrase it as like I'm watching a little more closely now. Week 1 against Arizona, it wasn't like all out, like Kansas City against Mark Andrews taking him out of the game plan, but Arizona did do their best effort in trying to remove Dalton Kincaid from the game. And then in week 2 against Miami, in what was ultimately a rout, he gets banged up. I think we've had 2 games where I'm not taking a whole lot from, but like I said, I'm watching a little closer now just because the Bills haven't needed Kincaid to get going and they've been winning games, right? So if that's going to be a trend that continues, then I'm ultimately going to move down the road. But for right now, we're 2 weeks in. We can exercise a little more patience on Kincaid, but through 2 games, like I said, I'm watching a little more closely now.
Yeah, you look at the Thursday night game against the Dolphins. He only played 42% of the snaps after missing a bit of time, took a knee to the helmet. And Josh Allen, too, 13 of 19 in that game. It's not like they were chucking the ball around the yard in that game. So you can come up with a few different excuses as to Dalton Kincaid's slow start. But I think the way you put it is perfect, Ty. I am going to watch a little more closely now. Cameron, any final thoughts you want to chime in with?
No, I just think it's, you just got to watch the game script, because if it does turn into, hey, we're in week 4 and this is just how every Buffalo Bills game goes, then it's kind of like, this is the trend, right? It is an excuse like for Kincaid, right? But if they're just going to run the ball into the ground and, no team can stop them, then yeah, you do got to worry a little bit about Kincaid.
Before we dive into our next player, I got to talk to the 92% out there. Actually, I think we're still sitting at 93. Yeah, the 93% of you that are probably watching this video right now and haven't subscribed to our channel. We're going to take a moment to quick change that. You literally just have to rotate your mouse and your wrist about 90 degrees, probably not 90, a little less than 90. And you just got to click on the subscribe button. That's all you have to do. You can turn on that notification bell as well, so you know when all of our newest videos are up. We appreciate the 7% of you that are watching our videos and are subscribed already. Your support means a lot to us. If you listen to audio feed as well, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast from, thanks for tuning in over there too. Make sure you're subscribed. Have that notification bell turned on. Let's talk about our second player, fellas. Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. Gotten off to a slow start after getting paid prior to week 1. Week 2, 4 receptions on 5 targets for 43 yards. Now, we did see an uptick in snaps last week against the Vikings. Played 87% of the snaps instead of 60 in week 1. I'm wondering if the holdout effect is lingering into the season a little bit for Brandon Aiyuk because he did sign this contract only 1 week prior to coming into the season, and Aiyuk was not around for much of camp. Tyler, what say you about Brandon Aiyuk? Is it time to panic, or is there still plenty of room for patience?
I think there's still plenty of room for patience. I think this San Francisco offense is going to eventually kind of like the run game is eventually going to kind of slow down a little bit. I mean, Jordan Mason has been running the ball like incredibly well. He's gone over 100 yards in back-to-back games. I don't think many of us are expecting that to continue. So that just adds an extra reliance on the passing game, on a Deebo Samuel, on a Brandon Aiyuk. I think it's very safe to assume too, the contract holdout and all that stuff is definitely playing a part in this. Anytime any player holds out for any reason, it's always going to be a slow start. We saw it with Josh Jacobs. Heck, I was listening to this on the radio. Even offensive linemen, this happens to. Trent Williams was like hands on his knees, like catching his breath during the Vikings game because, again, he just was not around for training camp, like conditioning and all that stuff. Like that matters. No matter where you play, it matters. So I think moving forward, again, the snap increase in week 2 for Aiyuk was great to see. I think it's just really a matter of time. And I think, you look at the upcoming schedule, they've got the Rams, they've got New England, they've got Arizona and Seattle, then they got Kansas City, Dallas. Like there are matchups in the future where they are going to need to put up points. And we know that the San Francisco team can put up points. Yes, you may think like, well, they should have put up points against the Vikings. I'm just going to say it. Like this Vikings defense, I don't know how you're going to put up points against them. Like there was a picture that I sent to you guys this morning of like, there's 8 on the line. And the caption was like, yeah, Brian Flores ran a cover 2 Tampa 2 defense when 8 guys on the line of scrimmage. It's like, yo, that's a crazy kind of psycho coordinator there. So I think we don't need to, we don't need to take too much away from this past week in San Francisco. They're going to be just fine, and Aiyuk will be just fine too.
I was really hoping you'd bring up that Brian Flores photo that you sent because that was nuts. Where it's 8 on the line, you got 2 DBs on the left and 1 on the right, and there's literally nobody in the middle of the field. And you're like, what? Yeah. Like that dude is a legit psychopath. I mean, you saw Brock Purdy after the game talking to Flores. He's like, dude, your coverages are insane. Like, granted, we can all debate how good Brock Purdy is at reading a defense if he's a product of the system or whatever, but still, when there's visible proof that Brian Flores is just doing things that are absolute maddening, I'm not too worried about Brandon Aiyuk. I think he'll be just fine in future weeks as well. What about you, Cameron? Are you in the same boat, or do you lean a little more towards the panic side?
No, I'm in the same boat. And just going off all that, I saw the stat too. Brock Purdy's 14-0 against NFC teams that aren't the Vikings, and he's 0-2 against the Vikings in his career, right? So he plays well pretty much everywhere else in the NFC, except Brian Flores seems to have his number. But, Aiyuk starting out week 1 playing only 60% of snaps, and then this week getting back up to 87% of snaps, I think just further proves that he's working into this game, right? And I think, that's been the narrative going around for the entire NFL. We just see that one less preseason game, so most people aren't playing in the preseason. So these first 2 weeks are kind of those ramp up weeks for a lot of these guys. And I think that's very true for Brandon Aiyuk.
We'll keep it moving here then, because if we're all in the same boat on Brandon Aiyuk, no need to panic. He'll turn out just fine. We should have expected a slower start. Let's move on to a guy who we actually expected to have a relatively quick start, and that is Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. Now, you might be thinking, I mean, his numbers haven't been terrible. He's put up double-digit fantasy points every week. I think the reason why we're having this discussion, though, is that you spent a late first-round pick on Garrett Wilson with the expectation that Aaron Rodgers was going to elevate him to this top 10 status, and Garrett Wilson hasn't finished higher than the wide receiver 29 so far this year. So there is reason when you look at this Green Bay Packers New York Jets passing attack, to think, I don't know, is it going to get better for Garrett Wilson? Only 4 receptions on 6 targets for 57 yards in week 2. How panicked are we on Garrett Wilson? I'll start. I'm not that panicked on Garrett Wilson. This feels like an AJ Brown scenario to me, where he gets off to a slower start the first 2 weeks. Allen Lazard catches 2 touchdowns in week 1. You want to know how many 2 touchdown games Allen Lazard is going to have for the rest of his career? Maybe 1. Like that's it. Like if one of those falls to Garrett Wilson, we were talking about him in a totally different light. So I am ultimately not that panicked on Garrett Wilson. I think he's still going to see a crap ton of targets. I think 6 targets is going to be on the lower end that we see him receive the rest of this year. I'm just not willing to overreact after 2 games when I think the ship could turn around relatively quickly. And we see Garrett Wilson have 9 receptions on 12 targets for 110 yards and a score. And all of a sudden we're like, okay, why did we ever question this? Cameron, what say you about that?
I think what I'm a little panicked about is the ceiling. I just don't know if we're going to see, he could flash into the top 5 just because, Rodgers 167 yards, 178 yards the last 2 games. Their schedule coming up is New England, who's been, decently good on defense. They got lit up by DK Metcalf and JSN this last week. But I still think they're a pretty solid defense. Then he goes to Denver, and Patrick Surtain has locked down DK and George Pickens the last 2 weeks. He gets in Minnesota, Buffalo, in Pittsburgh, and then in New England. And then he gets Houston again. So my only concern is we're just not going to see that crazy upside. I think he's still a guy, you're going to be able to lock him in your lineup. I just don't know how many game winning or week winning games he's going to have over this next little stretch. So that's, I think, where I'm a little panicked. I'm just a little more pessimistic on that, but I'm not at the point where you're like, I got to trade Garrett Wilson right now. Kind of, so I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, no. It makes perfect sense. You're just more pessimistic on the future outlook. You're not looking to jump ship or anything. Rather, I'm willing to be more optimistic about it because I just believe in the talent. When these alpha guys get off to slower starts, and the only thing I really see is that touchdowns haven't fallen his way, and he's still giving me good volume, I'm willing to still bet on that. Ty, which side are you on? Or maybe there's even a world where you're right down the middle.
Yeah, I would say I'm probably on Cam's side of things, where the upside I'm struggling to kind of figure out at this point. I will say, going up against San Francisco in your first game, and then I said this in week 1. This Tennessee defense is severely underrated. Yeah. They are holding teams to minimal passing yardage. I mean, Caleb Williams had less than 100. Aaron Rodgers himself had only 176. This Tennessee defense is very good. So you then look ahead and you're like, okay, New England's got a solid defense so far. Denver, kind of like what Cam was saying. I think what I'm ultimately saying is that Garrett Wilson's probably just going to be what he has been over the last couple of years with Zach Wilson. He's going to be, sorry, that's a
I was going to say, that's a little harsh. I think, but you can own that if you want to.
I meant to say it more so Garrett Wilson, you know what you're going to get from Garrett Wilson, where he's not going to lose you anything, but he may not be the ultimate fantasy game changer where he's going to ultimately win you weeks, win you your league. So I'm not out on Garrett Wilson. It's just disappointing, I think, is my takeaway so far.
So yeah, I want to go back to your comment about the Tennessee Titans defense. I don't think people remember that L'Jarius Sneed is now a member of the Tennessee Titans. You now have L'Jarius Sneed and Chidobe Awuzie playing on the perimeter there. I mean, those are two very that is a solid duo at the cornerback position. So even if you're flipping sides of the field with Garrett Wilson, I mean, he's drawing a matchup with one of those two till they shove him in the slot. So I agree. I think this Tennessee Titans defense is severely underrated. Now, I want to go back to the panic meter on Garrett Wilson then. I am more optimistic. So I have my panic meter set at about like 38-40%. In terms of like, I'm willing to have patience here with Garrett Wilson. Where would you two fall on 0% being I have the most patience in the entire world, and the panic or the and 100% being I'm getting him off my team ASAP?
I think I'm right around where you're at. Listening to Ty's argument, I don't think I'm quite as pessimistic as Ty is on his upside, because I do recognize the path. Like I think it's still there because I do believe in Garrett Wilson. I'm worried about Aaron Rodgers limiting him. But as far as like overall like panic, I'm about where you're at, Lucas.
I would say I'm probably like 45% because we all know the greatness of Rodgers. This is not the same Aaron Rodgers as years past. So that definitely is affecting things for Garrett Wilson. Like I said, what you're going to be getting from Garrett Wilson most weeks. It's just a bummer that we're not going to be seeing. He may have some weeks where he does finish as a top 5 wide receiver. I just don't think it's going to happen as often as we wanted to.
Let's move on to a different position. We've talked about 3 pass catchers already. Let's talk about a running back. Let's talk Rachaad White. This is a fascinating one to me because Rachaad White had a solid week 1, but when the man only has 10 carries for 18 yards in week 2, only musters up 3.3 fantasy points against the Detroit Lions, I think it's worthy to raise some questions about, and especially in a game where this should have been a high-scoring game. Granted, Tampa Bay won the football game, but this was one where a lot of people were surprised Rachaad White wasn't more involved in the passing attack, that he didn't have 4 or 5 receptions for another 35 to 50 yards on top of it. The big thing is that Rachaad White has been so inefficient. Like, nothing new under the sun with Rachaad White. We're continuing to see Bucky Irving get more involved as well. Personally, if I'm playing in PPR leagues, I was banking on Rachaad White to have a big receiving day because it is impossible to run on the Detroit Lions defense. They are insanely good against the run. They're going to be one of the best run defenses in the league this year. So personally, I'm not so panicked. I'm sitting around like a 42% on the panic meter. Where do you two lie? And Ty, I'll start with you.
I'd say I'm probably closer to like 30%. I think it's worth mentioning that, Bucky Irving is going to be involved in the rushing attack moving forward. So this won't be, again, what we saw last year out of Rachaad White, where we're getting a top 5 running back on the year. But we do know that Rachaad White is going to be on the field getting more of the high value touches. When they get closer to the goal line, it's going to be Rachaad White, right? So I also want to say too, like this past week against Detroit, Tampa only put up 216 yards of total offense, and they ran almost like half the plays as Detroit did. So like I also, let me double check this. It was 1 for 7 in the red zone. Correct. Detroit was 1 for 7 in the red zone. Like, this was a game that like Detroit could have won by 20 if they capitalized more in the red zone. Right. So I think had the scoreboard reflected that, we would be giving this kind of a pass, which is like nothing went right for Tampa, but because things didn't go right for Detroit, we're now looking at this very differently for Rachaad White. So I would say like White's going to be fine. Yeah, it stinks that we're not going to get, top 5 running back usage out of Rachaad White again this year, but he's still going to be just fine. He's going to be a key part of that offense.
Cameron, where do you lie?
I'm closer to 50%. I want to be honest. I'm a little worried. Obviously he left this game with an injury for part of the game. He did return. So I don't want to hold it too close, but 1.8 and 2.0 yards per carry in his first 2 games after being wildly inefficient in his, his first 2 seasons of his career. That does worry me. Now, obviously Bucky Irving was not much more efficient in this one, right? 7 attempts for 22 yards. It's not like you were like, holy cow, why are we not putting this guy on the field? But that just worries me enough that I just don't know if the touches are going to be there. This is a guy who had 272 carries last year and didn't hit 1,000 yards rushing. He had under 4 yards per carry. And it's just the inefficiency is what scares me. Obviously the receiving work will still be there. Kind of feels like he might be a Tony Pollard from last season kind of year for him.
Ooh.
230 to 250 carries, about 50 to 60 receptions. I don't think he finds the end zone a ton. I mean, he didn't find it a crazy amount last year. That's kind of where I see it, which would return on ADP. So like, if he's going to return where you draft him. It's just the upside isn't there for me with Rachaad White. And I don't know. It just feels gross each week, but if he can have it like he did, week 1 where you get 6 receptions for 50 yards, you're going to be fine no matter what he does on the ground.
The other thing that I'll point out with Rachaad White and Bucky Irving is that, yes, while Bucky Irving has been on the field, people look at his week 1 numbers and say 9 for 62. Bucky was incredible in week 1. Why wasn't he on the field as much in week 2? Look, I don't want to take away when a player does good, but 30 of 62 of Bucky Irving's yards came on one play. And otherwise, you're looking at a guy who is averaging, barely 4 yards a tote. And then you look at Bucky Irving last week. Well, it was barely 3 yards a tote, right? So neither of these guys are big bruising backs. They both kind of have the same skill set where it's like, we're going to run the same thing. It's just going to be to give Rachaad White a breather when Bucky Irving is on the field. So yeah, I'm about in the middle of you two, where I could see a world where Bucky Irving definitely gets more and more annoying as the season goes on. But this is week 2 with one I'm willing to just 100% write a pass on for the sake of, we knew Rachaad White wasn't going to be efficient. And then you put him up against, a top 5, top 3 NFL run defense. And it's not going to go well. It's just not when the dude has never been efficient for his whole career. Fellas, let's take a quick break. We'll be back afterwards with another 5 players on whether you should have patience or if it is time to hit the panic button. We'll be right back. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100. Alrighty, we are back. We have discussed Dalton Kincaid, Brandon Aiyuk, Garrett Wilson, and Rachaad White so far on the panic meter. Fellas, we're going to stick in the same game for this next player as Rachaad White. Let's talk Sammy Ball game. Sam Laporta, the Detroit Lions. It has been, I'll use the word concerning start for Sam Laporta this year. And I am relatively high on the panic meter. I'm actually wondering if I'm not high enough on the panic meter. Now, I'm trying to separate overreaction from 2 weeks from this is the new reality of the Detroit Lions and what Sam Laporta did last year in fantasy football. But 3 targets, 2 receptions for 13 yards in a game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that he should have had a field day. I'm sorry, that's concerning for me. I'm sitting right around like a 70 on the panic meter. Cameron, where do you lie?
I'm actually pretty high too. Sam Laporta was a guy that touchdown wise, that's what carried him last year. And obviously, being a rookie, it was like, you kind of figured, hey, he's going to take that step forward. The touchdowns are probably going to come down, but the play on the field is going to be fine. But I don't think what we have really accounted for, especially us, is the jump that Jamison Williams has made.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, and he's gone from, he's not just the down the field threat. We're going to, he's caught, long touchdowns long passes each of the last 2 weeks, but he's tied for number 1 in the red zone targets right now in the NFL. He had, he's got 20 targets overall. They're using him all over the middle of the field. And I was listening to Josh Norris and Hayden Winks talking, and they're like, last year Ben Johnson's designing plays for Sam Laporta, but now you got a guy with 4.3 speed on the field, who's playing well. Why wouldn't you design plays for him instead? And that's what they've been doing. J-Mo and Amon-Ra both top 5 in targets, with Amon-Ra with 25. Gibbs has 13 targets as well. It's just Sam Laporta should have more than 8 targets right now because Jared Goff leads the NFL in pass attempts with 83. Right, he's below a 10% target share. So that's what's concerning to me is he's just not getting the targets that we saw last season. But yeah, I agree. I am a little concerned. So hopefully Ty's got a little optimism here to keep us from panicking too much on Sam Laporta.
I'm going to take a wild guess and say that he doesn't, considering we were all very out on Sam Laporta at his ADP this summer. But I think you're 100% right, Cameron. I think the emergence of Jameson Williams is coming at the cost of Sam Laporta. And Ty, I think you would agree with that statement. Because if you watch the games, you're right. JMO isn't just the streak down the sideline. Go ahead, run an all vertical route down the sideline. He's all over the field now, and Ben Johnson is getting him open everywhere to utilize his speed. So, Ty, I'm going to guess you fall into the same boat as Cam and I, and that you're actually more panicked than patient with Sam Laporta.
Yeah, I am, especially after this last week where, again, you're running over 80 plays, but Amon-Ra has 18 targets. Jameson Williams has 11 targets. Jahmyr Gibbs has 9 targets. And then you've got Tim Patrick, Khalif Raymond, and David Montgomery each getting 4 targets. I don't know if this is necessarily a teams are going out of their way to stop a Sam Laporta. So I may just have to go back and watch these games a little closer. But it feels like this offense is just kind of shifting to just focus on these skilled position wideouts in the running game. And I think that was ultimately the goal last year. It didn't happen. And that's when we saw Sam Laporta kind of come around. I'm concerned. Like I agree with Cam on this too. Like we all expected a little bit of regression.
Yeah.
We're hoping for a bounce back at this point because I don't think any of us expected it to start out this slow and this badly so far.
No, all the Sam Laporta nightmares from this offseason, all of our fears that we had around him have been 100% confirmed. But what we didn't calculate was this big of a leap from Jameson Williams, where Jameson Williams is a top 10 fantasy football wide receiver. And as I'm thinking about it, this is almost becoming like a San Francisco 49ers light situation, it feels like, in a lot of ways, except the targets are far more consolidated to an Amon-Ra and as of right now with Jameson Williams. And Sam Laporta is like the George Kittle odd man out here, where he's going to be on the field because he's too freaking good to keep off the field. But are the targets going to fall his way? 1 week they might, but so far through the first 2 weeks, it has been the Amon-Ra and Jameson Williams show. Then you mix in Jahmyr Gibbs, who they really wanted to get going early in this game too. So like I am worried that there's just such an embarrassment of riches here, which is never a bad thing for fantasy football. It leads to dynamic offenses. But if Amon-Ra is going to continue to get 8, 9, 10 targets a game, he's not going to get 18 freaking targets every single week. But if he still continues to sit in that 8, 9 range, well, at this rate, another 7 or 8 are going to fall to JMO every game, and that leaves Sam Laporta in the 4 to 5 range every single week. I mean, it's just not looking good for a guy you took in the second round. And again, the only reason why I'm not higher on the panic meter right now is because it's only week 2. Sam Laporta could come out next week and put up 7 receptions for 85 yards and a score, and everyone's like, okay, there he is. He's back to normal again. But man, through the first 2 weeks, it is, if I spent a second round pick on Sam Laporta, I am shaking in my absolute boots, because this almost looks like I just lit a pick on fire at this point, especially for how bad the tight end position has been through the first 2 weeks. Sam Laporta can't even crack the top 15 tight ends. Let's move on to another pass catcher, the guy that we were all relatively out on prior to the fantasy football season. Admittedly, I was most in on Michael Pittman Jr. still. I thought with Anthony Richardson coming back, Michael Pittman Jr. is just the safety. There's no upside here. I'm not excited about his upside, but I find it hard to believe that Michael Pittman would be a total fantasy flop. Well, that's what he's kind of been here through the first 2 weeks. 7 targets this last week, which you like to see, but man, only 3 receptions for 21 yards. 5.1 fantasy points in a game where they were chasing points against the Green Bay Packers. Michael Pittman Jr. has not been looking good to start this season. Cameron, I'll start with you here. How panicked are you on Michael Pittman?
I actually thought I was going to be more panicked than I am currently. And then I started digging the stats a little bit. He's still got a 27% target share, and he is still 9th in the league in air yards right now, which I was surprised by because he's a guy, that we've just seen over the last couple of years that he's just, the little dink and dumps, little slants, quick pass, safety blanket kind of player. But Richardson is trying to find him. And, they start connecting out a little bit, you're feeling a little bit better. But I am still panicked because Anthony Richardson has completed 26 passes in 2 weeks. 5 quarterbacks last week completed more passes than that in 1 week. So it's just, there's just not, like we talk about Lamar Jackson not having a big passing pie. The Anthony Richardson passing pie is like, that's not even like a personal pie. We're talking about like a cupcake at that point. And so it's just like, there's just not a lot of targets. And when he's hitting Alec Pierce down the sideline, and Alec Pierce is graduating from cardio king to the touchdown king now, it's just like, I don't know. I think where you got the panic meter, probably close to like 60-65% for Michael Pittman is probably about where I'm at.
The only reason why I'm like not full-blown panic on Michael Pittman is because I do think there's still a world where Anthony Richardson, like the mean averages out here. And Anthony Richardson could have a super efficient game 1 week and balance this all out. Now, how likely is that? I have no clue. Could the first 2 weeks actually be representative of his passing pie and his accuracy across the entire year? Yeah, I'm worried it actually could be. But I find it hard to believe that Michael Pittman isn't going to catch less than 50% of his balls consistently that are thrown his direction. So that's the only that's the room for optimism I have here. Granted, I don't think there's any upside attached to this. Ty, what about you? Cameron and I are both sitting right around like the 60 to 70% mark on the panic meter. 65 is probably the appropriate number. Where do you lie? You're goofy and you're on mute. Unmute yourself. Buffoon.
Dude.
Hold on. Don't even
That
talk
happened
yet.
again?
Don't even talk yet. That's for you. I'm sorry. That was necessary.
I'm just trying to stay hydrated, but not like get the the drinking on the mic. My bad. Gulp. No, I'm right there with you. I don't think any of us anticipated the struggles of Anthony Richardson in the passing game, or at least in the or just passing in general, to be like this bad. Where like, again, I'm not like going to say that like Richardson is, ultimately proving what he is that he is just not a good quarterback. I just think like there is just some maturity that is going to happen here with this Colts offense with Richardson. I think we kind of took for granted just how advantageous of a situation Michael Pittman was in last year with Gardner Minshew. There are still some good signs for Pittman, right? Like he is still clearly the one. We always knew that he was never going to be utilized downfield. That seems to kind of be the trend still. I just think this is part. I don't want to completely chalk this up to like the growing pains of this Colts offense, but I feel like really everyone in this Colts offense has been going through that outside of Alec Pierce, because like you said, like this, hello, who is this Alec Pierce? Where has he been the past 2 years? So I'm right there with you. Like I'm not full-blown panicked because like we kind of expected this, but maybe not. We expected this kind of production. We didn't expect it to look the way it has looked.
We'll keep it moving. Got a few more pass catchers here on the slate. But actually, before I transition, I think it's worth making a comment. The reason I feel like there's a reason why we have so many more pass catchers on the panic meter. It's because passing has been down in the NFL this year. Touchdowns have been down in the NFL so far this year. And as it's been noted by a multitude of smart people in the industry, I mean, there are teams that are just playing too high shell coverage so much more frequently this year. Like that is the popular defense to play. So these defenses or these offenses, all of a sudden, they're not getting any massive chunk plays down the field. There's a guy who coming up here where his quarterback only completed 6 passes ahead of the line of scrimmage. And you would hear that number and you would be absolutely mind blown that quarterback only completed 6 passes ahead of the line of scrimmage in week 2. It's not this guy's quarterback, though. It's not Amari Cooper's quarterback because Deshaun Watson is cheeks. I mean, I cannot watch Deshaun Watson throw a football. It looks unnatural. It looks like he's forgotten how to throw a football. If he has to put any sort of zip velocity on it, it's sailing 10 yards out of bounds. And the fact that Amari Cooper is still drawing the targets, it's like the only reason why I'm open for optimism. But like Amari Cooper, out of all the players we've talked about today, is the one I am most panicked on by far, because I believe in his quarterback situation the least. I'm worried Deshaun Watson is absolutely cooked. Ty, you share same concerns, or do you want to speak some optimism into the Amari Cooper managers?
I think my biggest takeaway is this Cleveland offense is almost like unrecognizable from last year. And that's, again, that may be because it's Deshaun Watson versus Joe Flacco and the multitude of quarterbacks that they used last year. But, Rich Rebar tweeted out last week and this week, so this is updated to week 2, yards per pass attempt and motion rate per dropback. Cleveland is bottom 4 in motion per dropback. So they're not making things easy for Deshaun Watson, and then they're also bottom 3 in yards per pass attempt. Like they are not real. Like this offense is not functioning. There's nothing good happening with this offense. Does it stink that they lost Njoku? So maybe teams are going to try to, put more, they're going to pay more attention to Amari Cooper. Sure, if that's the excuse you want to use. I just think that this Cleveland offense just isn't as isn't as good as we have hoped that it was going to be. Maybe that's Deshaun Watson's fault. Maybe that's Stefanski, whoever's fault it is. I'm at the point, I said this about Jacksonville yesterday. I don't really want anything to do with this Cleveland offense. I don't care if it looks good or bad. If it becomes good, I don't want to be a part of it still, because we know what the floor is, and the floor is where we are right now. Like it is not good. So I'm fairly concerned. I shouldn't say fairly concerned, because we used that phrase last week and it means something completely different than what I really mean. I'm pretty concerned. Like I'm trying to move Amari Cooper as much as I can. If I'm looking for like running back depth, like I tried to swing a trade for Brian Robinson Jr. before this past week, and I was like, gosh, maybe. And after Brian Robinson runs for 120 yards and Amari Cooper bottoms out again, there's no chance of that happening. So I think we are at the point for Amari Cooper, at least it's time to move on, and it's time to try to, it's time to pivot.
We talk about buy low, sell highs, buy highs. I said sell high twice. I meant buy high. That's what I meant. What I actually meant to say was, is there is it worth selling low on Amari Cooper? So Ty's nodding yes. Cameron, are you willing to sell low on Amari Cooper?
No, I'm not. I am panicked.
You're going to be the optimistic one out of Ty and I.
I am going to be the optimistic one. I'm a little panicked, I will admit. I mean, you have to be. If you've watched Deshaun Watson, you can't. I couldn't, with a straight face, tell you I'm not panicked after watching Deshaun Watson. However, I do think the targets are going to be consistent for Amari Cooper. He's 3rd in the NFL in air yards, right? He's top 15 in targets. It's disgusting. It is gross. But if you drafted Amari Cooper and didn't realize that variability was going to be part of the Amari Cooper experience, I'm sorry, somebody lied to you, right? That has been part of the Amari Cooper experience for the last couple of years. His next stretch of games, he goes at home against the Giants, then he gets at the Raiders, at the Commanders. So at least 2 of those games are extremely favorable. So if you're going to trade him, I don't think his value is going to get lower than it is right now. Right. I don't think anybody's going to be like, oh, shoot. He and if it does, okay, but what could you trade Amari Cooper for right now? That's what I'm saying. It's like,
right.
You go get Deontay Johnson. Oh, whoopee. Like the same.
He's
same
also
situation that works.
stunk.
Exactly. That's what I mean. So it's like I
They
just don't
benched
think
his quarterback for week 3.
Yes, and that's what I mean. Like I think Amari Cooper, offense wise, is in the same spot. Like except the Browns can't really run the ball either. So I would wait these 3 weeks and hope at least 2 of the 3 weeks they play a bad enough pass defense that Amari Cooper breaks free, because I think the volume is going to continue to be there. And if Watson can show any sign of life, or the Browns go, you know what, we're just going to put $200 million on the bench and let Jameis cook because we want to sell tickets, then maybe that's what they do too. I think Amari Cooper is a talented enough wide receiver, though, that I'm not full-blown panic. Am I 75% of the way there? Yes, but I'm not full-blown panic where I need him off my team.
So you are sitting like panic-wise, you are in relatively the same range.
Oh, 60 to 75%. I'm probably actually closer to 60, but I mean, you have to. If you've watched Deshaun Watson in this offense, you have to be somewhat panicked.
You have to be.
You have to.
If Jameis, is it crazy to say that if they do put in Jameis Winston, Amari Cooper's stock is back on the rise again?
Oh, 100%.
Is that crazy?
100%. This team could almost be a playoff team if Jameis is their quarterback. That's how bad Deshaun Watson is right now.
Oh man, I do. So I have like 2 ideas around Amari Cooper that I'm both like intrigued but terrified by, and they all involve that Washington Commanders week 5 matchup that'll be. You could go ahead and just sell high on Amari Cooper after that matchup, because if he doesn't take advantage of the Washington Commander secondary, then something is really wrong. But that's also my same fear in that same sentence, is that everything is so wrong that Deshaun Watson can't even take advantage of the league's worst pass defense. So Amari Cooper is going to be a fascinating experiment. You're not going to be able to get much for him right now. He's going to have to sit on your bench until further notice, but it's going to be that Commanders game. And if he can't take advantage of the Giants, great. But man, even in that game, if I got other options, I'm willing to explore them ahead of Amari Cooper until Deshaun Watson proves to me he can hit the broadside of a barn when driving the ball 15 or more yards downfield, even 10 more yards downfield. Let's move on. We got 2 players in the same game to wrap it up here, fellas. Unfortunately, we got to talk about Travis Kelce again this week. He was on last week's episode as well. But when you only have 1 reception for 5 yards and you were drafted in the early 3rd round as the tight end 2, and you have been a staple for fantasy football managers over the last 4 or 5 years, we have to talk about you on the panic meter. And admittedly, I am pretty panicked at this point. I get conserving Travis Kelce, but man, oh man, in a game that put up 49 total points and Travis Kelce only has 1 catch for 5 yards. I think I'm more concerned about Travis Kelce than I am Sam Laporta at this point. It's not by much, but where do you 2 lie? I'm sitting around, again, right in that 60 to 70 range on the panic meter. Cameron, where do you lie?
I'm a little panicked too, because after last season, this dude, from week 8 on wasn't even a top 10 tight end in the league. He's averaging 10.5 points per game. He's had 8 points total this entire season so far. And so you're looking at a guy who in his last 11 games right now is averaging less than 10 fantasy points per game. Like that I don't know how that's not concerning, especially when you take in the fact that he's 34, and that they've added more weapons on this team. So it's just, I don't know. I don't think you can sell on Travis. I don't think I can hit the full panic button, but man, I genuinely think he's the closest one I'm at to full panic, because of the age cliff and because we saw this last season. And I don't know. He's still running 85% of routes, so it's not like he's not out there anymore. It's just they're not throwing him the ball, and so I don't know. I'm getting there, Ty. I'm getting there.
I mentioned earlier, quarterback that only completed 6 passes ahead of the line of scrimmage this past week was indeed Patrick Mahomes. I do think that played a part into Travis Kelce's lack of production, but when one of those completions was also a beautiful go ball down the sideline to Rachaad Rice for a 40-something yard touchdown, I don't know, man.
Hmm.
I am getting worried about Travis Kelce here. Again, not trying to overreact to 2 weeks, but when he's not getting the volume, that's what he's thrived on. When he's not the focal point of the Chiefs' offense, it's worth being concerned about. Ty, how concerned are you?
I'm more concerned about Laporta than I am about Kelce.
Okay.
That being said, I would still put myself at around like 65-70% for Kelce, because I just looking at the routes, at least in week 2 for Kansas City, Travis Kelce still ran the most routes. Now, you can make the argument that like Kelce plays more in the more important regular season games, the bigger opponents, fine. If you want to make that argument, fine. The fact is he ran just 29 routes. That was the most. And he played 59 snaps out of 65. So like there were not many opportunities for receivers, and Rachaad White just kind of took advantage of the big one right on his touchdown. I think I just need I feel like no one's really talking about this Kansas City offense. They are not firing right now.
No.
Like they are hitting the same early season struggles that they hit last year. Maybe just different struggles, but they're struggling. Like I'm just looking at their stats compared to opponents. They're 5 of 17 on third downs. So they're not sustaining drives.
Correct.
Right. And then you take into account too, like each game that they played in has been close. The defense has not really been shutting people down, which you would think would benefit Mahomes and Kelce and Rachaad White. I think like I'm willing to give more patience to this Chiefs offense than I am to a Sam Laporta, right? Just because with Sam Laporta, we've seen the emergence of other talent versus Kansas City. We haven't exactly seen it yet. So exactly what Cam had said about Amari Cooper, we're like, you have to be panicked. Like there is no world where you're not. But I would say I'm still holding out some hope for Kelce.
If you can trade Travis Kelce right now, would you?
Man,
that one's tough.
Because
it depends what you get.
That's the thing. It depends on what you get. But the other thing is too, like Kelce's one of those guys that if you trade and Kansas City figures it out and Kelce's like the main man, you're going to look like an absolute idiot. Right. So I guess it ultimately comes back to what you're going to get for him. And I don't think you're going to get anything worth a Kelce value.
Someone offered you Brandon Aiyuk for Travis Kelce. Would you take it?
I'd probably take that.
You would take that.
Want to hear a wild one?
Yeah, I do. I hope it's the name. I hope it's the name that I'm thinking. I really want you to
I
say
would
it.
take, if I could get Brock Bowers plus for Kelce, I'd do it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I love that.
100% right now.
I love that. Yeah.
I do got to say, Ty, you brought up a good point. You talked me off the cliff a little bit because right now, Patrick Mahomes only has 3 more fantasy points on the season than Deshaun Watson does.
Oh, yes.
So that should just put into perspective how good this Chiefs offense has been.
Oh, no.
So it's, that saves me a little bit. So you pulled me back because I was like, man, are they really that bad? And I looked it up. And yeah, Mahomes only got 3 more fantasy points than Deshaun Watson. So they're going to get better, but it's still concerning.
Yeah, Mahomes and co, we're hoping for a big bounce back season for them. And now with the loss of Isaiah Pacheco too, maybe they do have to lean on the pass a little bit more. So maybe we shouldn't be so quick to write off this pass attack. But yeah, through 2 weeks, it has not looked great for Travis Kelce and a lot of the elite tight ends around the league. Last guy we're going to talk about on this episode, though. Same game, Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. My worst fears are coming true with Joe Burrow. And my biggest fear was that everybody was willing to just freely write off this wrist injury for Joe Burrow and that it's not going to be that big of a deal. And he's fine. He's fully recovered. Yeah, some days are worse than others, but he's fine. And then there's Joe Burrow who's like, yeah, I don't know. My wrist is pretty freaking swollen right now. And I can't grip things properly. like this is exactly what I was worried about. And is there a world where teams are just, not a world, but Are teams emphasizing Ja'Marr Chase in their defense when game planning for the Cincinnati Bengals? Absolutely 100% when you don't have T. Higgins on the other side of the field as well. That being said, I certainly expect more than 4 receptions for 35 yards and 7.5 fantasy points against the Kansas City Chiefs. Again, in a game that had 49 points scored. That being said, I don't panic on studs through the first 2 weeks of a season. I don't sit higher than a 55% panic meter. And the extra 5% I give past the 50% is, again, all the peripherals, the Joe Burrow wrist injury that is going to be a factor the entire season. The reality that this dude has been fighting for a contract all off season long and is now, Cam, I mean, you phrase it and I'll let you touch on it here in a moment. He's entering what appears to be his diva phase of being an NFL wide receiver. As Ty lets out a disgruntled breath as well. How panicked are you, Cameron, on Ja'Marr Chase? I'm sitting right around like a 50, 55%. I don't panic on these kind of players until like week 5 if it's a real trend. But where do you sit?
I'm less. I think you talked about AJ Brown earlier.
Yes.
I think Ja'Marr Chase is going to be that guy this year.
Yep.
And I think it's going to start with him playing the Commanders this next week. I think we could have a Ja'Marr Chase special. Burrow looked better in this one, right? I mean, he still wasn't fantastic, but 23 completions, 258 yards, and 2 tutties. Yoshi isn't going to catch 2 touchdowns every single week. Inside the 5. So I think I'm not too worried about Ja'Marr Chase not having any touchdowns yet. I just think, he looks angry out there. And, he got fired up after that penalty after that no call where he got a penalty called on him, unsportsmanlike. Obviously all the contract stuff. I think he's a squeaky wheel gets the grease kind of guy right now. I'm probably closer to like 40%, 35% on him. Honestly, I think he is truly a top 5 guy. Where like Wilson, I have the little questions on. I think Chase is cemented as that. So I think he's going to be fine no matter what this year. So I'm really not concerned.
What about you, Ty? Where do you lie on the panic meter? Are you closer to that 50% mark, or are you with Cameron down to the 30s?
So I kind of want to do a little bit of an experiment with this, because I think we talked about a guy that held out for a contract during the offseason, and we're not so concerned with Brandon Aiyuk. But when it comes to Ja'Marr Chase, we're a little bit more concerned because of what? I asked that more so rhetorically because I think I know your guys' answer, but I just want to at least get your guys' thoughts. Like, if there are people that are more concerned about Ja'Marr Chase than they are about Brandon Aiyuk, I think people need to just kind of take the step back and be like, there are some similarities in the situation between these two guys, and eventually they're going to come around. But I'm not too concerned. I think the Burrow wrist thing will just be played out of, it's going to be brought up out of proportion. It's just going to get blown up, and it's not really going to matter. Like you said, he looked better in week 2 than he did in week 1. This may be something that, like, sure, this offense may not be the 2021, Bengals team that went to the Super Bowl kind of offense, but there's still plenty of talent on this offense to still be one of the better scoring units and top, more efficient units in the league. I think the absence of T. Higgins matters too. Like, I'm willing to give the same amount of patience, if not more, because it is a guy of Ja'Marr Chase's status, right? With like a Brandon Aiyuk, and the patience I'm going to show him, I'm willing to show more with Ja'Marr Chase.
The one thing that you bring up the wrist thing again, and I know that's what I've really honed in on in terms of like where I'm at on the panic meter and whatnot. I just do think it's going to be a factor in more weeks than people may realize, where people are going to look at, well, why did Joe Burrow come crashing back down to earth and only throw for 167 yards this week and 2 picks along the way, right? Like, I'm worried we're going to get more of those games in this year, but I do agree in the sense of if you're not worried about Brandon Aiyuk, you have zero reason to be concerned about Ja'Marr Chase as well. So again, I think you can flex either way, but I actually, as much as I've been speaking pessimistically about Ja'Marr Chase. I actually probably have more optimism in a Ja'Marr Chase bounce back than I do in a Brandon Aiyuk bounce back. I just worry the floor could bottom out for a guy you spent a top 8 pick on in your drafts versus Brandon Aiyuk, and you spent an early 3rd round pick on. I just think the cost differential there boils into a little bit more of the urgency that you need for the player to bounce back. So that's the only difference I can point out there, but I think you're 100% right. If you're not worried about Brandon Aiyuk, you don't need to be worried about Ja'Marr Chase either. We'll wrap it up there, fellas. 9 players. Whether it's time to hit the panic button or exercise a little bit of patience here. Now, there's a lot of other players that we could have talked about in this episode. Leave yours down below in the comments. Who's on your roster? You're like, guys, fellas, I'm worried. I'm panicking here. Maybe we can talk you off a cliff if it's not worth panicking about. But we'll be back later this week. We'll be back with another trade episode tomorrow. And then we'll also have our starts and sits of the week to wrap out our schedule as well. I am at Lucas Wenzel on Twitter, at CamLawFFF for Cameron, at Tyler_Plath for Tyler. You can follow the fellas pages as well. FFLs on Twitter, the FFLs on Instagram, Fantasy Football Fellas on Facebook and YouTube. If you want more starts and questions answered too, you can join our Discord. That's down in the description of the video you're watching as well. Enough promos though. You got to get on with the rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, y'all. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see y'all tomorrow. Deuces.